Hi, this video is on autism and shame, and it's a topic I've been wanting to discuss for quite a while because, at least in my own experience, by far the most challenging part of being autistic has been this really deep sense of shame regarding social interactions. I think the root of this is because when a social interaction doesn't go well, there's often so much uncertainty about what happened. Was there a misunderstanding? Did I do something hurtful without realizing it? Did the other person need help or need reassurance and I just didn't pick up on it or didn't respond to them in a way that was helpful? Or was it potentially due to autism-related stigma? Maybe they consciously or unconsciously are not comfortable with autistic communication, or at least with my particular variety of autistic communication, and that played a role. And if we lived in a world where people were completely transparent about stigma, if someone were to directly say that they have, this degree of negative bias towards people who make less eye contact or people who talk in a relatively monotone voice as I do, um, that would be really helpful because then I wouldn't necessarily have to guess whether I had done something wrong in that interaction. But of course, we don't really live in that world. I think oftentimes people, myself included, I'm sure, are not fully aware of all of our motivations, and exactly what type of stigma we may or may not have. And even if someone is aware of it, they're not likely to say it directly. And so I think where this can often leave autistic people is in a position of having, multiple difficult social experiences throughout life, whether it's isolation, bullying, or just a constant sequence of awkward or otherwise challenging interactions with strangers. Um, and really being uncertain which part of that to take as genuine feedback and which part of that means maybe we should reflect on something, maybe there is a trend that indicates we could address a certain part of our own communication, versus what part of that is just due to the fact that society does have a lot of stigma towards autistic people and not necessarily taking it personally. Um, and I think that that can be tricky because I feel that either extreme is probably not perfectly healthy. I don't want to assume that everything that goes difficult in my life or everything that is difficult in my life is due to stigma against autism. I think that would prevent me from finding ways I can improve my communication or taking, personal responsibility for those things. And at the same time, I think if I were to take personal responsibility for everything that goes poorly in an interaction, that would be overwhelming because and would probably lead to feeling a lot of guilt over many interactions where nothing wrong actually happened, where it was just a communication mismatch or potentially, in some cases, a certain amount of stigma towards autistic communication. I think the second area that can really fuel autistic shame is being in situations where you don't feel like there's a way to address what's causing you anxiety or what's causing you distress. Um, and this can be really hard because I find that in the real world, there's often situations where there just doesn't seem to be a perfect answer. Um, in general, but also as it relates to autistic traits. So for example, I'm a pretty punctual person. I experience a lot of anxiety around punctuality. Um, and at the same time, I know that while I might feel anxious if a meeting runs even slightly late, that expressing that to other people isn't always going to be healthy either. I don't want other people to feel like they have to be perfectly on time at all times because firstly, that feels like it could be quite controlling. And secondly, that can create its own type of accessibility barrier. For many people, being completely on time all the time isn't healthy, isn't necessarily feasible because life can happen, things can come up. And so a little bit of flexibility can be really important for most people to feel comfortable and safe. Um, Even though for me personally, flexibility can be a pretty large source of anxiety. Um, it's an anxiety that I generally just kind of deal with internally. And I imagine that for a lot of other autistic individuals, there could be a variety of situations that are similar, like maybe someone with a sensory sensitivity is in an environment that just can't be adjusted. And, or maybe it could be adjusted, but they're weighing, is it worth asking for it to be adjusted if it's really hard to adjust? I think that the fundamental result of this is that for many of us, we end up developing a pretty large gap between our emotional state and our actions. I know for myself, there's a lot of cases where there's these small changes in routine that I find very anxiety inducing. So the emotional state of anxiety is very real, but it's not something that I express because I don't think it would be constructive in many cases. Or I might express it in, only in very specific types of situations. Um, and I imagine that for neurotypical people, they probably also are often in situations where they're not able to express their emotions as fully as they would like, but they may be, on average, more able to at least use their emotions as a guide. So, for example, if they are to the point where they feel really anxious or frustrated with how much something has been delayed, they can probably feel confident that bringing it up would not be perceived as being too particular. That other people would probably agree with them that yes, it has been delayed a lot. Let's address this. Let's collaborate to work on this. Or if they feel kind of an overwhelming sensory unpleasantness, that's probably not the correct term, sorry, that they can probably be assured that if they bring it up, others will agree with them or at least will understand what they're talking about. Um, and I think for autistic individuals, what's often missing for us is not only that we are often in very anxiety-inducing situations, but also that when you become so used to just kind of internally dealing with a certain type of anxiety or a certain type of overwhelm, it can be really tricky to figure out when you cross a threshold where it is okay to bring it up. Ideally, you'd be able to bring up anything, but as discussed, that's not always feasible. Um, and instead, you can just kind of become used to suppressing it indefinitely, even if you are in a situation where you could bring it up or where it would be well received. I don't know if this is an autism thing specifically, or if this is just a personal idiosyncrasy, but is having a lot of mental rules for interactions. I know that a lot of people are able to approach things more intuitively. And for example, they might have a general sense of if there's a disagreement, when do they want to focus on sharing their perspective with the other person? Or when do they want to focus on understanding the other person's perspective? How do they strike that balance? Um, how much detail is appropriate to share in a conversation? All these sort of different aspects of conversational rules. Many people will just kind of come up with spontaneously on the spot based on their knowledge of that specific conversation. And I really admire that. I think that that can be a really beautiful approach in a lot of ways. And it is definitely not my approach, especially in conversations that might be more complicated. I tend to think about them, a lot in advance. I don't necessarily have the best sense of intuition, so I try to kind of come up with a general framework, almost like a mental flow chart of, okay, if these parameters are met, then maybe this is a healthy response. If these parameters are met, then maybe this other response is healthier. And sometimes I'll mentally rehearse for a conversation um, how different uh, trajectories of a conversation might play out. And where I think shame can come in, at least from what I've heard of other people who have similar approaches, is that there's often this perception that if you are practicing for a conversation, or if you've planned out, what you're going to say or how you're going to say it, that it is calculated in a scheming type of way, or at least maybe to put it a little bit less um, negatively, that it's calculated in a way that makes it less genuine. And I don't think that's true. I think that for those of us who use this approach, it's typically because we genuinely want to do our best in a conversation, not only to share our own thoughts, but ideally also to do our best to make sure that the conversation can be healthy and constructive as possible. And that is, well, it does certainly have its challenges. I feel like I'd be remiss on a neurodiversity affirming channel not to point out that I think it too can be a valuable type of communication. That a lot of the other points have pretty similar themes, so I'll end the video here. If anyone has thoughts or experiences related to autism and shame or neurodiversity and shame more generally, that's something that I'd be very, very interested to read. And thank you very much for watching this video. Take good care.